Hey guys! So a couple days ago, released the HyperBole thing, which is nice. I'd gotten like 99.5% of the way done with it like last summer. I spent a month and a half, 2 months on it, and then I just couldn't figure out. I had this last kind of 4 second chunk where I wanted to make one shot that implied some sort of narrative, because you see all of these different racers going around, and I knew I could recontextualize the entire thing just by showing like one character close up and showing them specifically trying to do a thing. And I was like, oh, then it'll actually read as like a short as opposed to just a collection of VFX shots. But after being hung up on that for like 9 months, I decided, you know what, it'll just be a collection of VFX shots. It'll just be fun, because this whole thing was only made to be on a screen in the background of Dynamo Dream, and I just kind of like let it grow. So I was like, yeah, I don't need to kill myself on this. But okay, so the one of the questions I get the most from people is, can you do a tutorial about rendering? And I think when they say rendering, what they actually mean is lighting, because like rendering is easy. You just hit F12 in Blender and it renders. I mean, I'm being facetious. There's a lot of settings you could figure out, but it's the lighting that makes stuff look like how it looks. But even more than lighting, I think what they're asking for is a tutorial on composition, because as I've talked about before, a lot of my lighting is just kind of ambient light with like a sun lamp coming in, but it's the way that sun lamp hits things and creates highlights of interest and shadow for like positive and negative space that makes stuff read as anything. It makes it kind of interesting. And so specifically with the HyperBole, things are happening pretty quick, and so I'm trying to convey a lot of information really quickly, which means I'm trying to let the composition read really, really fast and convey a lot of information. And so I've always kind of felt as if I probably don't know enough to really talk or teach about composition. I just kind of have like certain instincts, but I figured I could walk through my different thought processes per shot, and so at least if you wanted, you could at least have some of those thought processes in your back pocket. So let's start with this one. I actually have two axes of symmetry, which is kind of neither here nor there, but it does mean that your eye is immediately drawn to the center with this big engine going on. When you first look at an image, your eyes are attracted to areas of contrast, and that can refer to contrast of detail too. If there's some area where there's a lot more happening, that's where you'll look. And in this case, that detail level is fairly uniform across the entire image, which means that's not going to be doing anything. It's all going to be lighting, defining where we look first. And I love putting haze into a scene because a depth map conveys so much information so quickly. In fact, you could look at a version of this shot that was just the depth pass and still get a pretty good read of how things are going. In fact, when you look at a depth pass, then you look at this render, it oftentimes feels as if this render has cluttered up, the nice clean depth pass. But what's great about it is that the black levels, wherever it's black, wherever the blacks are really loud to be dark, that means it's in the foreground before the haze has been added onto it, which means like right here, this bit right here is very clear to differentiate as opposed to the background. In fact, in After Effects, I export my base render and depth pass, and I'll use kind of fuzzy solids screened in behind this front area, and I carefully place them down here and up here just to make sure that those values are separated from the background. You can also see I placed the lights specifically behind the subject here just to get that contrast going. So there's big red lights down here, kind of white blue lights up here, and I stuck them behind there literally just so I get this nice strong silhouette right off the bat. The two different colors also sort of form a basic normal map for your brain really quick. Like if it's red, it means it's angling downwards towards this pit. And if it's white or blue, that means it's oriented upwards. And that can be a really, really fast way for your brain to be able to look at an image and immediately know what's pointing in which orientation. Future Ian here, just want to chime in. A lot of this comes across as if I planned it out this way, as if like I sat down with a sketchbook and made like Edward Hopper lighting diagrams or something. But I didn't do that at all. I would just look at the shot, and if I wasn't feeling the shot, I'd start messing around and adding in other lights. And a lot of times it's just you learn to find ways to randomize the shot just until you find something you like. Changing lighting angles or changing the intensity of a light or changing a camera angle, or a lot of times if you have a big open scene, swapping out the HDRI so that the light is just hitting different, can all be great ways to just start poking around to give you something you can start refining. You don't have to go into it with like a great sense of what you're trying to do. You can just find it as you go. I also obviously have some depth of field going on here. I used probably a bit too much depth of field over the course of this. I'll talk about that more later. But you can see the background's blurry as opposed to the foreground stuff you're supposed to be looking at, which is a lot sharper. And the same with when the door opens. You can see it's still bright outside, and I did that for two reasons. The first one, so that this silhouette, we can still see it really clearly, and the other one was just that impact of a door blasting open and being blinded by the light like you're running out on stage or something like that. I kind of wanted to capture a little bit of that. If we look at the solid view, you can see that my character animation is actually really bad. Like, her head rotates, she leans forward, and I was for a lot of this, I'm relying on the camera animation to really tell most of the story, and I do have a lot of Rococo mocap data doing stuff later, but yeah, I was very much assuming you'd be looking at the engine and all the flames coming out, and not really noticing that my character animation is pretty darn subpar. Also, like, the animation for this only works from the camera, really. Like, that kind of looks bad. I'm only thinking, how does it look from the camera? You'll also notice there is nothing outside of the camera's view. And that, a lot of this actually, everybody was asking, like, these render times must be crazy. But render times are usually only really crazy if it's an internal scene, because that means the light paths have to bounce around trying to find a light source or an exit. Whereas in this case, everything is open, so the light just has to bounce off of something and, you know, find the abyss, and it's good. And so yeah, everything was actually fairly lightweight to render in general, which was nice. And here's the next shot. In this one, so one thing I was doing a lot in the HyperBole, which I don't normally do, is I'm trying to make everything overwhelming. I'm trying to edit fast enough and have enough details in there that you feel as if you're missing things, that you can't, like, look around fast enough. Which means in here, this is actually a very simple shot. It's a background and it's a rocket. But I've added all of these particle systems, you know, these tiny little bits of debris and the sparks and the stuff coming off to make it feel as if, you know, a lot's happening. But all your brain actually has to pick up on is this one tumbling shape. And I specifically, you know, like, let it go out of frame. Your brain is really good at anticipation and physics. Like, it's all about flow of motion. If you have something, you know, like a person who jumps like, whoa! People know they'll be coming down over here, even if they go off camera. And so if stuff leaves the frame, that isn't the end of the world. I'm not trying to advocate for, like, super shaky cameras, but at some points, having things be loose with the frame can be really handy. In fact, I've worked with, like, I used to make a lot of 48-hour films with people who had their roots in theater, and a lot of times when they would shoot something, they would just back up and set up the camera and film the entire scene. And then they're like, oh, we need another angle. So they'd, like, take a few steps over and do the exact same thing again from a different angle, which cinema has, like, a very rich language that we all have built in from being, you know, growing up watching a lot of movies. And a lot of that is determined by zooming in and deciding what should have focus. And so if you're just backing up, you're kind of ignoring a lot of that. That said, I mean, there's a lot to be said for having that backed off God's eye view, and that's kind of what I prefer, because it means the filmmaking does kind of get out of the way, and the audience does get to kind of just watch and discover and find things for themselves, and that can make them feel a little bit more engaged, as if they're actually, like, there in the room just passively observing this thing. But that was not at all what I was trying to do in the HyperBole. So yeah, sometimes if you just take a shot that you like and just zoom in like 30%, you might find you like it even more. It's kind of weird. But also, in a lot of these shots, the animation of the subject is so hectic that I tried to keep the animation of the camera fairly linear. It's usually just doing, you know, a scroll from side to side or a push in. And actually, so when you're animating a camera, especially digitally, you want to be thinking, what are you trying to represent? Are you trying to represent an actual camera? Is it one that's on an actual, you know, like Hollywood camera rig? Or is it being handheld? Does it have like a steady cam going on? Or is it somebody just with a handy cam shaking around? And so in this case, I was originally thinking that everything was going to be, this was going to be like a TV broadcast, so every shot I had in it had to be justifiably filmed from somewhere, which would mean a lot of backed off telephoto shots, you know, filmed from somewhere in safety. Or then I thought, okay, well maybe the cameras could be mounted on rails, like literally inside the track, which would help me get a little bit closer in there. Or maybe like, you know, helmet cams or something like that. And then because I kept kind of pushing it to just get the shots that I felt like getting, there's something I did in the crab battle with the robot where I had actual floating cameras in the scene, and so any angle you see could justifiably be from one of those floating robots. And so I kind of thought, all right, well maybe that's how they're filming the HyperBole, except you don't actually see any of those robots in through this. So that's I just made what I felt like making in the end. Going to the next shot, I'm cutting on the animation of this tumbling rocket, and there's a lot going on in this shot. Maybe too much. But since there isn't even a plot, I wasn't really too worried about people like not catching everything. Right here, this is the subject. It's the big dark thing right in the foreground, and you know, 10 frames later it's zipped away, but that was enough to tell the audience like this is the main subject of the shot. From an animation perspective, the most important part of this was honestly, again, the flow of motion was feeling right. A lot of it is like you did when you were a kid, you had, you know, a toy jet or something, like I did that all the time. And like if I was watching a shot and I wasn't making the mouth sound effects, I'm like, it's not hitting me right. So right here, it swoops down. I want this like woo, woo, woo feeling, and so it's woo, 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 and trying to get that was kind of tricky, and it was people will forgive a lot of things as long as it kind of feels right. And getting this was a combination of animating both the iteratively animating the jet bike thing and the camera to kind of get that following motion. When I was animating this guy, and actually a lot of people throughout the course of the thing, I would pretend they were on strings, kind of like rotating around a fulcrum, because the really great thing about pendulums is it's kind of making a promise to the audience. You know, it's anticipation. If something goes up, if Hulk brings his arms up, he's going to be bringing them down, and so you have him on the hook for that minute without stopping any of the action. And in this shot, I did that both for this the main character and for the HyperBole right there. They both kind of swoop in and kind of come in together. The HyperBole is where I dropped the ball on this shot, or where things didn't work out perfectly. Like, I wanted it to read very clear. Look at this. It's huge. It's in the foreground. It's blocking the main subject. I was like, it's doing its own thing, but there's just so much happening at that moment that it didn't totally read, and that's fine. But it did mean I didn't totally nail it. This also introduces a problem that I ran into a lot over the course of this, and that's that when you're trying to show where something is, kind of think of the depth map example, you can have a certain set of values, and if there's a big dark thing in the foreground, then that will immediately read. But because I wanted it to read, I added all of these lights on the background, or on the back of it, which sometimes helped, but other times kind of formed a noise camouflage. And so is it the bright thing in the foreground? Is it the dark thing in the foreground? And the answer is actually no to both of those, and so it actually doesn't even read, even though it is this high contrast thing zipping by in the foreground. And at the end of the shot, I do a punch zoom in, which is I guess a good time to talk about focal length. So if you're moving down a track and you zoom way in, it doesn't look like you're moving all that fast, because all you can see is the perspective shift, you know, there on the horizon. Whereas if you zoom way out, suddenly you feel like you're going a whole lot faster. And so that's a really good trick if you're ever trying to shoot, you know, a low-speed chase scene. Shoot as wide as possible, and it's harder for the audience to get a sense of how fast things are going. And because I actually did shoot with a few long lenses looking straight down the track, sometimes I had the track just whizzing by at kind of like unbelievable speeds to maintain that feeling of speed. I'm also not a good animator, really. Like, I understand the physics side, kind of that flow of motion and all of that, and I know how to see if something's bad and kind of try to keep hacking stuff off until it's not noticeably bad, but I'm not actually good, which means I'm trying to let the camera and the physics do as much of the storytelling in this as possible. In fact, one of the ways I went about that, I simplified life for myself, is the race is static. It's the course that's moving over everything, which means all I had to do was animate this one racer moving through everybody else and the ball, and that made my life so much easier than trying to, track the animation curves of all these different racers moving and always having to recenter the camera all the time to see how stuff's going on. I did the same thing with this shot right here. These guys are stationary. The camera's shaking like crazy, the background's moving by, but these two models are just kind of sitting there. One thing I did a lot for this was try to keep the background as negative space, and even though it's changing a lot, there's a lot of blur in it, which means it still kind of defaults to just reading as unused negative space, which was really, really handy. And I tried to define when you'd see the audience in the background and when these panels would come in to just really let these moments read right here. I have lights whizzing by, which did a bunch for that feeling of speed. Like, no two frames are the same. It's just, yeah, it's very, very dynamic. But that also means that compositionally, like, is it the foreground that's bright and the background that's dark? Is it the background that's bright and the foreground that's dark? That's changing all the time, which meant keeping that camera kind of nice and locked and keeping too many things from happening really did help a lot in terms of like being able to quickly look at the scene and see what's going on. If I had added any more chaos into this, your brain probably would have had a little bit of a harder time. And I still don't. There's a bit more than I think you can pick up. There's these two guys. They're both trying to get this, but then this other one kind of comes in and spooks it, and hopefully that reads. If I'm honest, this shot actually only exists to show off these two racers. I put a lot of effort into these bikes, and I just wanted to stick them somewhere. I wanted to have my little aviator guy. And so you can see the limits of the 2020 quarantine, though, and that I have Sean as the luchador, and he appears a lot of places. And this is the mannequin head that I had. Where did it go? Yeah, I got the mannequin head right here, and I was trying to find a leather coat for the longest time, like a nice, aviator leather coat, but I ended up just mapping some stuff onto a low poly thing and doing a physics sim on it, which turned out fairly well, actually. And this shot actually isn't even finished. Once they zip away, this is obviously my blocking geometry right here. That's just some extruded cubes, but I kind of feel like that's fine. This shot is a nothing shot. I was always going to replace this. In fact, this is going to be where I put that final shot I was talking about that hopefully established some story or something. It's kind of cool to see all these cameras, I guess, but it doesn't say anything. I just kind of put it in there because I realized I was sitting on this project for too long, so I was like, well, we'll just make the shot a little bit longer, because I'd rendered a long version of it, and then we'll just fill up that gap and we'll just release it. Okay, this shot has everything I've been talking about. The blurring background, ideally reading as negative space. I've got some very shallow depth of field. I actually cheated the depth of field in this shot quite a bit. This is about as shallow as I can get before things start looking like a miniature. When I say shallow depth of field, the depth of field is the area of the scene that's in focus, the distance from the camera that's in focus. And if the depth of it is shallow, that means you're only getting this narrow cross section away from the camera that's in focus. And depth of field is a byproduct of the size of the aperture on the lens relative to the scene. And so if you have a very shallow depth of field and a very blurry scene, that implies either that the scene is very small in the case of miniatures, or less commonly that the lens is very big. So there's some physics involved in that, and we're aware of this through our familiarity with media. In fact, one of the tells of stuff filmed in miniature is that the depth of field is just too small. Like, stuff in the foreground is just a bit too blurry, stuff in the background is just a little bit too blurry. And one way you can get around that is by shrinking the aperture to simulate, a smaller lens. Downside to that is you're getting a lot less light. And compound that with the fact that usually when they're shooting miniatures, they're shooting them in slow motion so that everything happens a bit slower. Like if you have a dam exploding, they'll film that all in slow motion so everything looks bigger. But that means you get even less time to expose each frame because you're exposing more frames, and so you have to use a really sensitive film, or now, camera digital sensors are a lot more sensitive. But yeah, I have a bunch of haze going in here too, because I just really wanted this silhouette to read. And that's one of the things, is having that kind of key image in your head that you're going for. This shot is actually two shots in one. There's this one right here, and you can see like they're existing in the negative space and all of that, and it's all fairly laid out. Like, I tried to make this moment read as an image, and then there's the beginning, which is the surfing bit, which has almost nothing to do with the rest of the shot. But yeah, you can see here, this one still has the moving lights, but this background blur. We're looking at him because he's staying, stationary relative to the camera. Everything else is nice and blurry. I honestly thought that these muzzle flashes, because I made them what I thought was really bright. I thought they'd really read compositionally. They didn't. They didn't really. They're just kind of a thing that are there. And you can see here, it actually kind of helps that feeling of the swoop, that he goes off frame a little bit. And it implies a bit of humanity to the camera operator, as if they don't know what's happening, and it makes everything feel a little bit more live. Again, I'm not advocating for things to be crazy shaky all the time, but if you have a slight delay of 6 frames when something happens and when the camera catches up, that can imply there's some human actually operating the camera who didn't totally know what was going to be happening. This shot is actually kind of 2 shots in one, or at least the beginning's a little bit of a throwaway. This beginning, the first 20 frames, are just me showing off these assets here. I wanted people to be able to pause on the gauges and see, I put danger and guns and sexual tension in there, and I like these hands and all of that. I just thought anybody who was enjoying the HyperBole might also enjoy, looking at some of these greebly bits. And so this is, I think I'm implying this is a helmet cam. That's kind of a point of view shot, only one in the thing. And a second later, it's gone, and we're looking over here. And this is, again, the same thing. These guys are static. I was able to animate the shot actually really quick, because these two people aren't really moving. They're just staying still, and it's the scene that was rotating, which was a little hard because I had to rotate the entire environment, but then at the end it straightens out, so I had to get all of that to blend okay. And the fact there's kind of a slope going on meant that I kept accidentally clipping into the ground a little bit. But yeah, I kept this back wall nice and flat, again trying to keep it that negative space so you can easily read what's happening with the pilot trying to catch the HyperBole. Boom. This is also, so a lot of times I'd make the shot and I'd look at it and I'm like, this doesn't feel fast enough. So I would just, with the set moving underneath, I would duplicate the entire digital environment, stick it at the end, and we just fly through it twice, so we'd be, really booking. But because this one was a curve, I couldn't do that, which is why this one, and we're also looking down the track with a fairly long lens, which was all just working together to mean that this shot doesn't feel quite as fast as the other ones, but I think that's okay. Also, just workflow-wise, this shot, I just animated, in the Rococo suit, somebody trying to catch a ball, parented them to the jet bike, and animated the center of gravity shifting a little bit when she'd leap off the bike, and it came together in just a few minutes. It was a really good demonstration to me of how that type of workflow could let you make stuff like this without having to spend days and days. It got me really jazzed. The popcorn bot, this was supposed to be a racer-oriented shot. All the racers going by in the background are actually arranged in a way that was supposed to be fitting a narrative and kind of filling in oh, okay, and then this is happening. But as they go by, they just, you see them for, a couple frames, and it wasn't reading at all. So I ended up just, putting big lights on them and making the moving lights be the real subject of it. And then, but then people were looking at how awkward these digital doubles were, so I added this popcorn bot in the foreground to distract the eye, basically. This entire shot is just trying to distract from itself, which is kind of funny. I do so this is a type of robot that appears in Dynamo Dream, and I like having this here just to kind of show to people who watch Dynamo Dream later, oh, these are the same world, and this type of robot was kind of a standard model. This one, unfortunately, has been turned into... there's always kind of existential issues when it comes to the sentient robots, and this one is the popcorn robot. Oh, yes, okay, this is the Advent Children shot. Back in, 2006, I guess, they're releasing Advent Children, which was the CG film based off of Final Fantasy VII, which my friends and I were very into at the time. And that trailer and the resulting film did some cool stuff with cinematography, where they'd have fight scenes where the camera would just whip and punch in, or they just put in random whip pans, somebody would wind up to punch, and they would just cut to 5 frames of the camera whipping through the scene, and it would just read as like, woo. It was all about demonstrating that flow of motion. They would just they whip the camera and zoom in on stuff, and like just to show if somebody was going to jump, they would just have that type of motion demonstrated somewhere, even if it didn't make any sense in the actual context of the fight. It was all about that feeling, and so I tried to get that a little bit. I didn't nail it because it punches in the zoom here, and so ideally the next shot should also be echoing that type of punch-in movement, but instead we're going to a point everything's coming down. But I still thought it worked kind of okay. Just woo, boosh, you know. It flows enough. It was also a freebie. Like, this is just that same shot we're about to see, but just rendered out from another angle, which means I got 2 shots for the price of 1, which was kind of nice. So this shot here is covering a lot of ground, and a lot of it was kind of this dance of trying to anticipate where the viewer would be watching. Like, ideally, my assumption is that when we first cut here, the focus and everything is on this engine. We're seeing stuff happening. The sound design is telling us, you know, to look here. And then you ideally would notice that he's punching this bike here. Unfortunately, I made the exact same mistake that I made before, where his fist, I gave him this big like power fist thing, and I put these bright white lights on it, thinking that would help it track, but instead, you can see it just makes it 100% blend into the lights and the values of the background. So, oops. That said, you do read that something has happened by the time the bike explodes, and so that's fine. So around here, you're looking at this bike. You're watching it crash. It falls behind the main character here, just in time for her to jump up. And this is that pendulum action, and this is, we actually hold this for a second. You can see that the background is reading as a negative space. This is a momentary composition we get, and it has that pendulum action, and so it's kind of that stored energy, whoa, which I tried to, you know, really pay off with the swoop back in. It didn't totally work, because when she kind of comes in and breaks, that almost feels as if that loses the energy that she stored. But it's still, I think it all reads fairly okay. This is another one of those situations where, because I want it to feel really fast and we're looking down the track with a fairly long lens, we are absolutely booking it. We cover 3/4 of a kilometer of track over the course of like these 7 seconds. The amount of space that goes by every frame is actually pretty intense at like a human scale. And yeah, okay, so there's also there's from the side telephoto shots, and I really like those because, one, they imply that the camera is filming from a safe distance. It actually does evoke you know, like racing imagery where, you know, camera's just mounted on a balcony tracking stuff. So you have the background moving, and it's kind of that anime type idea of like the lines passing by in the background, and it just implies we're going this way, and you get to just focus on the main character. So I have that kind of going on, and it's back in the day, one of the first tutorial I ever put up back in like 2011 was about how to animate spaceships flying through the atmosphere, and it was like just animate a spaceship rotating around and just have clouds whizzing by behind it as fast as you can, and it's still a fairly good technique. And I do that here, but then I shift axes, and so this right here is all about, like, again, you're just looking at her whizzing by. Everything is blurring along in this direction. And so yeah, that's basically it. A lot of it's just about trying to hand feed the audience the information they need as quickly as possible, and when they first start looking at the shot, they should immediately be able to identify what's important. One thing I do a lot is, as I'm working on a shot, whether it's in Blender or After Effects or whatever, is I'll zoom it way down, and I'll kind of blur my eyes, or I'll just like look away and I'll look back at it, and just how does it read? How quickly does it read? And that's the thing you can get a sense for. It's actually one of the things I appreciate about social media and people sharing stuff on Instagram and all of that, is because if you're trying to make your image pop as somebody you're scrolling by, or as it, you know, reading well as a thumbnail, the best way to do that is to improve your composition so it pops, so it reads really well. And so I think people are actually getting a better sense of composition because they're focusing on that social media aspect, and I think that's actually kind of a cool thing. It's just going to make your storytelling or your images read better and more clearly, and convey that information faster, and a lot of times make the image more pleasant to look at. But yeah, I'll have some more tutorials coming soon. I realize basically every tutorial I upload is a byproduct of just me messing around in Blender figuring stuff out. And usually me messing around in Blender is a byproduct of working on the CG for an episode. So because I'm in between those episodes at the moment, I haven't had as many little things like, oh, I should do that. But I'll make a tutorial about I think compositing stuff into live action footage. Just a few more tricks for that, because some folks have asked for that. And yeah, all right. I will talk to you soon. Have a good one.